Thank you, Tilly, and thank you, DQ and AXCON for allowing me to speak today about essential accessibility annotations for smoother design to development handoff. Yes, that's a mouthful. My name is Carrie Fisher. As Tilly said, I'm the Director of Digital Accessibility at Teslio. I'm also a human-computer interaction PhD candidate at Iowa State University. Sorry to the interpreters for that mouthful as well, but I'm also a primary author of the Web Dev Learn Accessibility course. And I'm here today to talk about design annotations from the perspective of a front-end developer and accessibility specialist. I am not a designer, nor do I pretend to be one, as you will soon find out when you see the demo. Having spoken at a few events in the past, I find the best way to kick off a presentation is to give your audience some bad news. So first, the bad news. It may not come as a huge surprise, but the digital world as we know it is inaccessible, very inaccessible. According to the results of the Web AIM Million, a very important study that I've linked here, lots of links in this presentation, 96.8% of the top million websites across all industry sectors had WCAG failures when tested with an automated accessibility checker. Now let that sink in for a minute. Using an automated tool, almost 97% of all websites failed some aspect of WCAG. And if you're already familiar with accessibility testing, you know that automated tools cannot detect all of the issues of your digital product. So once you factor in manual and assistive technology testing, it isn't hard to imagine that this number is very close to 100% of all websites are inaccessible. So websites, a digital product that's been around for over 30 years, are pretty much unusable by a huge percentage of the population. Never mind newer products like native mobile apps and emerging technologies like XR, or even the fact that WCAG standards are really just a starting point when it comes to true digital inclusion. If we look a bit deeper at the Web AIM Million data and filter it by issues that can be easily addressed in the design phase, we see the top issues fall into these top 5 categories. So low text color contrast at 83.9%, empty links and buttons at 77.3%, missing image alt text at 55.4%, skipped and missing heading levels at 50.3%, and missing form labels at 46.1%. If you're familiar with the Web AIM Million, this bar chart may look a little bit different from what they present. Additional issues such as missing document language, proper use of landmarks, misuse of ARIA, etc. Those things are very important to address, but it kind of falls out of the scope of this talk. And of course, I can't give you bad news without a little bit of good news. So the good news, according to research from DQ, that up to 67% of all WCAG success criteria can be covered in the design phase. That means that even before one line of code is written, you can cover up to 2/3 of these success criteria. This graph here from an article Anna E. Cook wrote on auditing design systems should look very familiar to many, or at least a version of this. It shows the cost, both in terms of money and time, for implementing changes to the software development lifecycle. No matter the type of bug, be it performance, security, accessibility, the sooner you think and plan for it, the cheaper, quicker, and less frustrating it will be for all who are involved. Sounds great, right? So how do we support this shift in thinking and integrate accessibility into the design phase? Enter the accessibility design annotations. So design annotations in general are just used to explain creative choices and describe different aspects of the design. Accessibility annotations focus on areas where developers can make accessible programmatic choices with the guidance of the design team or an accessibility-focused specialist. Accessibility annotations can be applied during any stage of the design process, from wireframes to high-fidelity mockups, and they can include user flows, conditional states, functionality. They often utilize symbols and labels to streamline the process and keep the design as the main focus. Depending on what program you're using to build your design, you should have multiple annotation starter kits to choose from, and some today that focus on accessibility. Or if you prefer, you can create your own set. In either case, you should decide which information needs to be communicated to the handoff team and what format works best for them to receive that information. For this talk, I'm going to be using Figma as a design program. and the Indeed accessibility annotations created by Stephanie Hagedorn. She spoke at Axon, I believe, last year about this as well, so check out her talk. And a mock-up of the homepage of Accessibility Talks. It's an informal monthly accessibility meetup I founded back in 2017. So the design is pretty basic, but while I demonstrate the annotations you might apply to the design, the question we are looking at to answer today is not necessarily how to annotate, but what to annotate when it comes to accessibility. Since I work with clients of various sizes and across all industries in my role, I chose the WebAIM dataset due to the size and breadth of its scope. By sheer volume alone, it'll give us a general sense of what the accessibility issues on the web and potential user impact when we focus on remediating these. But I highly encourage you and your team to gather your own data, select your own set of essential accessibility annotations that are more focused on your specific user needs. All right, first up, color contrast. Have you ever tried to read the text on the screen and found it difficult to read due to the color palette, or maybe you were sitting in a very bright or low light environment? Or maybe you're someone with a more permanent color vision issue, like the estimated 300 million people with color blindness, or the 253 million people with low vision. As a designer, you definitely need to understand how people perceive color and contrast, whether temporary, situationally, or permanently, and this will help you best support their visual needs. So yes, color contrast. It's arguably the heart of accessible design. So with all the awareness with the color contrast, documentation, tools surrounding color contrast, it's really surprising, could be surprising to you that low text color contrast was still found on 83.9% of all home pages. This was the most commonly detected accessibility issue 4 years running. On average, each homepage had about 31.6 distinct instances of low color contrast. Again, this is data from an automated accessibility checker. So if we start to consider text on top of gradients, text on top of images, images of text, SVG generated text, etc., things that automated checkers can't catch, these very large numbers are probably even conservative when it comes to color contrast issues in the digital space. So this bar chart is showing in 2019, the issue was 85.3%. In 2020, it was 86.3%. In 2021, it's 86.4%. And today, 83.9%. So arguably, pretty flat across the board. A little bit of improvement, but not a lot. All right, so that felt like an extra amount of bad news, but the flip side of all those sad numbers is the tooling. There are only 831 million color contrast tools to help you get this right. Some of these include color contrast checkers. So I'm going to show just a couple here on the screen, but just in case you've not heard of these tools, but the Adobe Color Analyzer is one of them that you can pop in hex values, you can pop in other types of design values and get your WCAG color contrast ratios. So for regular size text, that's that 4.5 to 1, so text against the background. And for large fonts and essential imagery or bolded regular fonts, you have that 3 to 1. I'm a huge fan of TPGI Color Contrast Analyzer. The reason why I like this, I don't know of any other standalone tools that do this on this level, but I love this one because, especially for designers, because you can check the things manually that you can't check with the automated checker, like that text on top of the gradient or that text on top of an image. I even use it when I'm doing mobile testing. So I'll take a screenshot, I'll take it to my desktop, and then I'll use this tool. It gives you at least an approximation if you don't have that data available, the code base. And of course, there's a bunch of plugins, including in Figma. I lost count of how many color contrast ones there are on there, but just pointing out one that's called Contrast. It's really kind of cool because you can kind of spot check certain text, or you can look at your whole design and it'll look at all the different layers and like give you information about which ones passed, which ones failed, A, AA, and AAA. And the last one here I'm showing is the color blindness simulator. So I hate to even show this tool because I believe really strongly that disabilities cannot be simulated. Each individual has their own perspective. They have their own experience when it comes to perceiving the world. But these things do exist, both on this, this particular instance, and then I've seen a lot of filters in the different design programs. So it's useful to know that they exist, and they can be useful in terms of approximating a potential perspective. We just keep in mind that if you're going to use tools like this, know that you need to use it in a context of a larger conversation around disability. All right, so that's kind of like the highlight of some of the different types of tools that are available. No excuses, there are lots of tools for color contrast. So that being said, which elements should we be annotating when it comes to color contrast? Long and short is all of them. Seriously though, color contrast should include all the different combinations of colors in the palette, from most accessible to least, for text as well as essential icons. The success criteria that color contrast mostly falls under are 1.4.3 contrast minimum, 1.4.11 non-text contrast as well. So what we did, or what I'm showing here, is a alley color palette. So again, color palette generators, there's a lot of different options that are out there. My friend Mike Herschel actually even just built one called Contrast Grid that lets you enter in things beyond hex like RGB, HSL, HSLA, and then more excitingly, you could actually put in CSS variable names, even with comments in there. It's pretty amazing. So if you've got a lot of content or a lot of, variables, color variables, you could throw them into that tool. Whereas this one is pretty simple, it uses hex. But what it's showing here is a combination of all the design colors, and it's doing it from most accessible to least accessible. So this thing can sit inside of your design comp. It can sit external, or there's a lot of different places to put it, right? This is a visual representation. It doesn't have to be this visual. You could write this out. You could do little samples, or avoid this, go for this, right? Or there's a lot of different options when it comes to how you want to present this information. But just getting like a lay of the land, I really highly encourage people to at least understand which color combinations are going to work best together. Excuse me. So on this one, the color contrast annotations, I failed to mention, but this is a Figma demo. It's got this link, the source. It's pretty gnarly, so hopefully we can get someone to copy paste that in there, but it shows all the different states. So this one is showing a representation of the color contrast annotation. So we've done the gradients. We kind of analyzed what we wanted to do. We made our choices when it came to colors. And then now we're putting that into the design comp, the annotations. It's probably a little bit of overkill to give that color contrast ratio on the actual annotations. But I wanted to demonstrate a way that you could do that, right? Just to, in this case, we have a light mode and a dark mode. And so the annotation includes that information. So it'll say something like, it's got 4.6 to 1 on white, or we have 4.6 to 1 on black, right? So there's different options to give a little bit more detail to your developers. All right. So color contrast is really primarily a design issue related to or relegated to the land of style sheets. But when it comes to structural images or elements such as links and buttons, we start to move into that coding HTML type territory. And I know that some designers might not be super comfortable annotating elements directly related to code, but I highly encourage you to get over that uncomfortableness, because the underlying structure of the page is one of the most important aspects of digital accessibility. And so structural conversation should really begin at the design level, if not earlier. For when you build your digital product using structural elements instead of relying on styles alone, you give critical context to people using assistive technologies such as screen readers. So in this section, I combine the link and button data together and into one entity, because from a design perspective, at least for annotations, the objective is very similar. Whether it's a link or button, critical information about the purpose of the interactive component was left out in the majority of the cases. And so that's what we're trying to capture with this particular annotation. So empty links, empty buttons. If you look at the real data, so what we have here, I'll read the chart real quick. 2019, we had 83.1%. 2020, we had 88.6%. In 2021, 78.2%. And in 2022, 77.3%. And if you break that out and just look at links versus buttons, links are trending down. So it started out at 58% in 2019 to 50% now, whereas empty buttons have a different trend. They're going up. So 25% in 2019 and now 27.2. So it's a little bit of an increase. But you can see that, you know, again, across the board, there's not been a lot of change in this area. So looking again back at our demo, what information should be captured for links and buttons? Links and buttons should be identified as focusable elements in the design and should include the different states and information about the purpose. So the main success criteria around this one is 1.3.1, info and relationships, because we want to make sure that that relationship, that information is presented to the user. If you're using a screen reader and you run across a button, let's say that doesn't have information about where it's taking you or what action you're going to take, you might be reluctant to press that. So here's an example of button states, right? So we have the default, we have focus, hover, active, disabled. I think designers are pretty good about doing the states. I think the part that maybe we need to think about when our annotations is a little bit more information about the links, about the action, also how the button and the link are sometimes grouped. So I broke apart the link and the button annotations just to keep it separate. But here for the link annotations, we could tell people whether the link is internal or external, because that matters to people. Link to the location. You could also include things like the accessible name. I'm hesitant on sometimes design annotations saying, hey, use ARIA label, or hey, use this particular coding technique. I think that sometimes the constraints of the environment or some considerations that maybe they don't understand about the full coding environment that the developer is working in, they may not have that choice. They may not be able to choose that particular option. And so this idea of getting it a little bit more broad and just saying, hey, this needs to have an accessible name. And, you know, I suggest that maybe it'd be this, but kind of giving a little bit of freedom to the developers, just as long as they're aware, like, this is something that we need to pay attention to. Same goes for buttons, very similar to links. Buttons, you could also include, obviously, the action, if it's an actual type button, tab stop information. For instance, we're having that skip to main content, or if you use screen readers, a lot of times it'll say skip to content, right? We've all heard that who tested with screen readers. So skip to content, it would be one of those kinds of instances where we would tell the developers, hey, this is actually a skip link, skip button. We're going to encounter it as soon as we get to a site, we're going to press tab, and this is the first thing that we're going to see. So it's maybe important to highlight that this is doing that particular action, for instance. Another thing I'm demoing here is this concept of group. So in my case, the demo of the logo and the word Alley Talks, they're grouped together as one button. So they're not separate, they're not different links, you know, they're all one entity. The same thing will come true down here in the social media links. Pay attention to that, because that will come into play later on. And again, these are all the links and button annotations together. All right, alternative text. So before even one line of code is written, you have to think about the messages that the images are conveying and how they'll be used. This is why image alternative text is a perfect thing to annotate in the design phase. And who best to write that kind of annotation than the person or team who are making the choices of the images in the first place, or the icons. So this is one of those pieces of good news. So in 2019, we had 68.0%, 2020 is 66, 2021, we have 60.6, And in 2022, we have 55.4%. So the news is out on alternative text. So that's a really encouraging news. So that means that people have either there's a check in place, or they're looking at it in a different way and adding it to the code base. So that's really great. However, just because the missing alternative text, so again, missing, I shouldn't be confused with null alts. So null alt would be ALT equals quote, quote. And that is a signal to a screen reader user or a screen reader device to skip over, or an AT to skip over it. It's decorative, right? So an empty or missing alternative text is something completely different. It's just that no alt is there. Of this number too, 10% had questionable or repetitive alternative text, such as the alt was there, but it said image, or it said graphic, a blank file name, right? I just encountered one when I was doing some testing that said image alt here, like that was the alt. I don't know. I guess it was descriptive, I think, in one way or another. But really, when I look at things like this design comp, I ask myself which icons, which images are essential to the story. So alternative text needs to be meaningful. It needs to be added to all essential images and icons. And then also we need to consider hiding things that are decorative or non-essential. So asking yourself questions about the purpose and context of the image will help you determine how best to convey the information to a person using an assistive technology, such as a screen reader. So you may ask yourself questions like, is the image essential to understanding the context of the feature? What type of information is the image trying to convey? Is the image simple? Is it complex? Does the image elicit emotion, right? Or prompt the user to act? Or do we just call it visual eye candy? Of course, as I kind of mentioned already, alternative text is not enough. It also needs to be meaningful. My example here, if your image is about a pug wearing a Yoda costume and your alternative text reads dog, you know, does that convey the full message of cuteness, right? Everyone needs to know about this pug wearing a Yoda costume. So I would argue that the alternative text dog would not convey that information. So the success criteria related to alternative text is that 1.1.1 non-text content. So going back to our demo, we just removed all the images, all the icons, everything on the page. Does it still make sense? Maybe pause for a second and look at it. I would argue, like, this is probably like the worst demo for this particular instance, but I would say that almost all of the images, or all of the images in this particular part of the demo, could be considered decorative, right? In my mind, and again, those icons come into play down there because they're already wrapped in buttons. And so I want to hide the actual image file from the screen reader user because the button is already conveying the action and where it's going, right? On that element, we have the accessible name. So I've seen like a billion times also that kind of concept where you have an icon, it's usually an icon, and you have its action wrapped into the button element. And then the image says image, it'll just say blank image, right? And a lot of times you're using SVGs as well for your icons. And so they're hidden as well. You could argue separately, but like here, I know who the speaker is. I may not know what they look like in particular, right? So I've decided that from my perspective, that these would be considered decorative. So after saying all of that, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Eric Bailey's Smashing Magazine article, "Your image is probably not decorative." He wrote that about a year or so back. And he argues that many elements we see as decorative could actually contain useful information. And so I've seen that firsthand when I worked at DQ with a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Tim Harshberger. And we were in a training session and we were training the client about accessibility. And one of the things he was demoing his screen reader, as he is a blind individual. And so he was demoing the screen reader on this job posting. So he sees the title, a little paragraph, and like a button to go to apply for this job. And he's like, this looks great. This sounds great. I can use all the things, the elements on the page. I can press this button and now I go to a new page and I can apply for a job. And I said, so wow, so my experience is totally different because what I'm seeing on the page are those things, but I also see all this fun imagery of people, doing company picnics and events and the office space and all the really cool things that this company was showing about their, hey, join us, we're this cool company, our office space is amazing. And so my feelings when I watched it were completely different than his feelings when he read it with a screen reader. So Tim said to our client, and I'm kind of paraphrasing a bit, as a screen reader user, I can always choose to ignore or skip over elements on a page that I find that are redundant or verbose. But what I can't do is make up information on elements that are hidden from me. And so long story short, alternative text can be tricky. So definitely something to have conversations about internally before you decide something is decorative. All right, that was a lot of information on alternative text. So moving on to headings. So as we discussed in the links and buttons section, a digital product structure is very vital to so many users. Structural elements such as headings serve as an outline for the content on the screen, but they also act as anchor points to allow for easier navigation within the content. Headings are often the primary way screen reader users navigate a page. So when we fake headings using styles alone, the appropriate structure isn't conveyed to these users, and they have to change the way they navigate and read the content on the page. So, okay, looking at this data, it's pretty straight across the board as well. So I actually combined skipped headings from the Web A1,000,000 and the missing headings information data set together because they're kind of both important. So before anyone gets all upset about the skipped headings for a WCAG conformance purposes are technically not a fail. So if you went from an H2 to an H4, that technically is not a fail. What would be a fail potentially is if that order got to the point where it made the whole outline not make sense to the person using it, right? There's a little bit of gray interpretation, and I'm just like waving my hands in the air a little bit. So I don't want anyone to yell about that particular issue because I think that one's one that trips a lot of people up. But because the heading order is so important to our AT users, like the screen reader users, I wanted to include it in this data set. Now, missing headings, that for sure is an issue, right? We do not want something that visually looks like a heading to be not marked up as something, or we're just not adding headings to anything, or we're doing it for some but not for others, right? There's a lot of information that is conveyed through that programmatic heading level. So in 2019, we saw 51.2%. This is an issue. 2020, 51.5%. 2021, 49%, and 2022, 50.3%. And if you separate out skipped headings from missing headings, you see an interesting trend. So in 2019, 36% of this data, these top 1,000,000 sites, were skipping headings. And then today we have more. So it's like 40.4%. Whereas missing headings trended like in a really positive direction, trended down. So we went 14.9% missing. And now today we have 9.9% missing. So that's kind of the good news, right? But again, automated checkers, there are some limitations to even finding headings, right? So we look at this design comp and we say, how many headings are on this page? What are the levels, right? So headings, we want to make sure that we include programmatic levels and pay attention to that reading order, and making sure to include anything that looks like a heading. So success criteria that headings fall into is the 1.3.1 info and relationships, the 2.4.1 bypass blocks. You need to give a mechanism for users to go past multiple repeated elements on the page. And then of course, 2.4.6, which are headings and labels, making sure that they describe the topic or purpose. And I kind of talked about the heading order already. So this is a visual that's talking about a taco recipe, right? That is the main information on this particular page, taco recipe. Secondary to that are ingredients, steps, nutritional information, and other recipes. So this order is telling me that all of these, secondary things are falling under the taco recipe, whereas the tertiary ones are the steps. So cook meat, chop vegetables, assemble on a tortilla, and that's under steps. And so I know that it's related to steps. If that information was under, other recipes, the context would change and it would be confusing. I wouldn't quite know what was going on. So this is why we're talking about the skipped order of the headings. So again, I think this one's pretty straightforward, but you'd be surprised how many annotations do not include heading levels. Again, when I would get design comps, sometimes I'd have that information, but a lot of times I wouldn't, or the converse, I will get a style for a heading. So this style should be applied to this, piece of content. This, this heading. So something that looks like a heading, let's apply this heading style H2, right? Instead of programmatically deciding this is an H2. Maybe I'm going to say something a little bit radical, but I really think that styles should be separated from the programmatic structure. So let's think about the structure first from developers that are out there. Think about the structure first and then applying the style to it. So something like here, where we have an H2 for the really main, heading here for Alyssa's talk, redesigning for cognitive ease. But then we also have an H2 for a different style that's below it for December 2022 that looks completely the opposite, right? It's not big and red and bold and large. It is small and gray and in a different location. But structurally, this makes more sense. And we're going to be applying different styles depending on, the format or the layout of the particular element. Maybe making some enemies there with that conversation, but again, programmatically, I think of them as separate, and maybe they should be separate in your organization as well. All right, so last but not least, let's talk about forms. Forms are considered one of the most difficult elements to get right from an accessibility perspective. They have a lot of different parts. There's a lot of specific rules that you're needing to follow. Forms they vary, right? They can be as simple as a single field, or they can be super complicated and be a multi-step form, multiple fields, input validation, CAPTCHA, right? There's a lot of different kinds of forms out there. So there are many form elements and states a designer could highlight and should highlight, but we're going to do something super basic and just talk about form labels. And the reason why we're talking about form labels, as you saw earlier, that's a big kind of area still today that has some big issues. So again, of the data that we're looking at in 2019, we have 52.8% are forgetting their form labels. In 2020, it's 53.8. 2021, it's 54.4, and 2022, it's 46.1%. So the trend is going down slightly. It looks really great, but we had gone up until 2021. So all this being said, it's still a major issue. Anything over a certain percentage, I would consider something to at least consider adding to your annotations. This doesn't account the additional 39% of the form inputs that were identified. There were 4.4 million form inputs identified that were just not properly labeled. So I didn't even include these in those numbers. So if you think about form elements that are both missing and or not properly labeled, then this percentage goes really high, right? We're getting into like the 70s or the 80s, right? Depending on what numbers you're looking at. So this could be even a bigger impact if you consider that it's properly labeled. All right, so going to our example, which form element should be annotated? This is the world's simplest form, but we've all seen this, right? It's a modal. It says, join our newsletter to receive the latest updates and events info. We have presumably a text placeholder. Let's hope it's a label, and then a button that says subscribe. So form labels, they are a must, right? They outline the relationship between the label and the input. Helper text, error messages, success messages, all those things are really great and beneficial. But if you're just talking labels, just have them being there, creating a relationship to the input, and then visually persistent. So they shouldn't disappear. I think we've all been there. We're in the middle of a form and we're like, oh shoot, what was that? What was I entering? My email, or was it my name in this field, right? Because the label disappeared as soon as we started typing into it. So success criteria that these fall under, definitely 1.3.1 info and relationships, 2.4.6 headings and labels, and the 2.5.3 label in name. Here's a quick screenshot from that Indeed annotation help text that they include. And what they're showing here are 2 relationships, well, technically 3 relationships. So we have time period, which is the group, the full group. And then we have the from, going to the input of both the month and the year. And then we have the to, so time period from, and then the to, the month and the year. And so the time period should form the larger relationship, right? These are 2 questions in a form field. In my mind as a developer, I'm putting this, as like a field set, right? And then we have the different inputs that are underneath it, and then their label related to it. So in our case, for our annotations, like again, we would probably have different phases of the form. We'd be showing error messages. We'd be showing all kinds of different things here. But what I wanted to annotate just in this very small one is that this was a label. And in this case, it's a floating label. So once people start typing in, the idea is that it'll stay visually persistent and it'll just move up. And then also the autocomplete information. So when you get into specific form fields, there are certain inputs that you have to map to certain, I don't know what the word is, like code, right? So in this particular case, there's a certain, what is that, attribute maybe that you're linking to a particular subset of fields. So there's certain fields that are outlined in WCAG that say, hey, if you're going to be asking for this information, it needs to be linked to this particular attribute or this particular, form field element, right? So then if you're doing things like autocomplete, somebody could go in and then just autocomplete really fast because these things are mapped correctly. That's like another story for another day probably. But the point is here is that we're showing that this is a label. It wasn't a text placeholder. It was floating, so it's always visually persistent. And then what kind of field this particular thing is. So it's a pretty simple one. All right. Wrapping up towards the end here, just again, showing this top design focus issue 2022. And again, this is kind of my idea of what to use with this data set. So again, we have that 83.9% for the low text color contrast, the 77.3% for empty links and buttons, 55.4% for missing image alt, 50.3% for skipped and missing headings, and that 46.1% missing form labels. So by addressing just a few of these, or even just one, it would significantly improve the accessibility across the web. I did some quick math and I found that if every single designer developer team out there addressed just one of these categories in their next website feature or sprint, there would be an average increase of accessibility by almost 63%. Like, so one element, right? So Charles even said, recognizing the need is the primary condition for design. So today's challenge after all that information is really to recognize your user needs for more accessible products and build your design around that need, not the other way around. So I definitely challenge you to take on just one of those elements, add it into your workflow, and our world will be a little bit more accessible. All right, so I wanted to give a thanks to everyone that came today, of course, and a special thanks to my mentor, Glenda. I'd be lost without you, both personally and professionally. So I appreciate you, and I appreciate all the mentors out there who take time to support people as we grow in this space. So thank you.
Carrie, thank you so much. That was awesome. We have a boatload of questions in our chat, and thank you for agreeing to answer all of them, not here and now, but offline separately. We're going to tackle a few of them now. I stuck one in chat for you. Let me read it out real quick for everyone. Understanding what and how to annotate often means having a good understanding of HTML and or how assistive technology actually works. What recommendations do you have to a large design team that doesn't really have technical HTML knowledge?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And it is true to a certain extent. And I think what the issue really is that developers and designers really just need to have more conversations, because in the situation I was in as a developer, like I said, when I got comps from people, way back in the day, there were no annotations really besides, this size, pixel height and weight and font size and, maybe a font information. But beyond that, we didn't talk about structure. We didn't talk about accessible names. We didn't talk about color contrast, right? And so a lot of those decisions came to me as a developer to figure out on my own. And if I wasn't somebody knowledgeable in accessibility, and I wasn't at first, I made a lot of mistakes as a developer. I kind of cringe sometimes thinking about the mistakes that I made. So it's that concept of you need to have somebody who knows what they're doing when it comes to accessibility. So maybe that's a specialist on your team to have this conversation with the design team or with the developers, or even just having the developers and the designers have that communication. I really think it kind of boils down to that, because the thought process as I'm putting this together, I'm thinking like, as a developer, what would I have wanted to know? What would I want to have heard from my designers? And there are certain things that I do want to hear from them. And then there are other things where I still want to make my own choice based on the environment in which my code is living and what I know that, let's say if I'm making like a component, what is the easiest to integrate within our design system that could be easily repetitive instead of something that would require something a little bit more tricky. So I don't know if that's like a cop-out answer or if I even answered the question, but I guess the point is that you need to have someone involved that understands the complexities of the digital accessibility space and those needs, and to decide as a team, okay, these are the things from an HTML perspective that we need to address in the annotations versus these are, our environmental constraints and the development process that we need to contend with, right? And it's going to be different for everybody. So, sorry if I didn't answer that very well.
I thought it was a very tangible answer for that. And the second question that I want to ask from the group kind of builds on that a little bit. So if you're dealing in a situation where there's huge technical debt, what kind of insights can you share about the handoff to software teams when that is the case?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, that's a really hard one to answer as well, because this concept of it's so individualized to each team and to each individual within those teams, what might be useful to some to say and others might not make sense. So I think of it, I guess the long story, or the thing that I guess what I would advise would be this concept of thinking about this in terms of this is a marathon and not a sprint. Right. And so if you've got all this debt that's hanging over you, or all these processes in place that aren't conducive to building accessible products, right? So you pick your battles, right? You pick one thing. You could see like literally color contrast, something that's in the hands of designers on a huge level. 80% is still not being applied, even with all the tools and the knowledge and the documentation. And the understanding. So where is that disconnect happening? So maybe that would be the first thing to even just focus on and really, kind of understand and kind of decide, okay, on this sprint, this is our focus, and, forget what all the debt is, forget all the things that we have to do and all the other things. Let's just kind of get into this mindset of like choosing one. And I think over time, as you see in accessibility, and probably Tilly, you've seen this a lot with clients you've worked with, it's, you pick one thing, you get really good at it, the communication is great, and then the next time you add a second thing, right? And that first thing is still there because you've already integrated that into your workflow. And so now you're just adding and adding and adding, and that cumulative effect over time is going to help with some of that debt and some of those things that you need to do but haven't done it. I always call it the mythical phase 2. That's what where we would put all the accessibility bugs. Oh yeah, we'll get to it in phase 2. And surprise, like it never happened. So you can't yet use that as an excuse. You really have to make it a priority in your sprint, right?
Yeah. I appreciate that. That was a big question. Let's give you an easier one here.
Okay, good.
Links and buttons have different functions, so should
Yeah.
those not be annotated differently? And what specifically is your take on links versus buttons on apps?
Oh man, well, you thought this was easier, but from a developer perspective, this has been a battle for many years. I remember even, a few years back, Marcy Sutton had written something about links versus buttons, and in the developer world, they mean a lot of different things, and the way you code for it, and the way that you, the way you just think about it in general is just they're different, right? But I wanted to put them together from an annotation point of view because on the design phase, if you're not telling people how to code, which on that level, I don't know that you want to be doing that. Again, if you are a designer out there that's super comfortable with code, you've got that background and you're a unicorn and you're part of both those worlds, and you go for it, go for it. I support you fully, and teach me your ways because I want to know. But for majority of teams and individuals, you feel more comfortable in one space versus the other. I consider myself more comfortable in the development phase than the design one, as you saw from the demo and all of that. But so in my point of the slide that I showed with them combined together is this concept that if on the design level, what am I talking about? I'm telling you it's a link, or I'm telling you it's a button. I'm telling you where it goes. Is it internal? Is it external? I might be telling you an accessible name, but I'm not telling you how to code it, right? So in that sense, it's an actionable component that does something. Like when you press a link, you go somewhere. If you press a button, there's an action. Sometimes you go somewhere. Sometimes something happens on the page. So the functionality may be different, but the concepts of what what is happening on a base level. Again, if you're adding a lot more detail, then maybe this isn't an advisable way to do it. But I'd say on the base level, they kind of have similar functionalities on a design base level. Again, not the I'm coding this tomorrow level.
Very good. Thank you. I think we have time for one more.
Sure.
I love all the questions that have been posed, and thank you again for offering to answering them after the fact. This one is, how can researchers best work with designers to translate findings from usability or other user research into useful annotations and get implemented so the site or the product becomes more usable?
That person, I love them for asking that question, because I've, as a researcher at Iowa State University, I'm learning a lot about qualitative data and quantitative data and what that means for your product. And I think even now, a lot of us in the design and development space, we don't necessarily take that into consideration, or we don't have that luxury of having a UX team or that data from our users to make those particular changes. So if you have that researcher talking about translating that usability into annotations, I mean, this is a great opportunity for the UX or that researcher to talk with the designer and say, hey, this is what we're seeing in our data. How best can we represent this in our design annotation? So I think, everything really comes down to communication, but if I got, like in this case, I used very generic data, and I love WebAIM and I love the data that they provide and that they've done this consecutive years. But what I would want to do as an individual is take the idea of what we saw today, use that user data that your researchers and usability or UX team is providing to you, and say, okay, those are great, that's a great starting point, but let's see what our users' needs are. If we're hearing over and over again that there's a certain feature that's not working with a particular screen reader browser combination, that is one of our things. And so how can we go backwards and say, okay, let's talk about how we have that conversation with developers when they're building that particular component or that particular feature. So I wish that I lived in a world where we had all that time and all that foundational research and teamwork, that we could build that more accessible product. And I think a lot of this is, unfortunately, our time constraints or budget constraints, especially in the atmosphere of technology right now is pretty intense. So this concept of, it's taking a step back and saying, hey, this is what we're finding. Like, how can we support the design team? How can we support the development team? How can we support QA and the product and everything else down the road to the end user, right? How do we do this? And it's gonna look different for everyone, of course, but I think it starts with just communication.
Gary Fisher, thank you very, very much. This was an awesome session. Thank you for all of our participants and our interpreters especially. Awesome day. Have more fun at AxCon. Hope to see you again. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.